refusal, this no that you hear at the end of the text, which, as I tried to say earlier, I think is a refusal to that entire techno-political law that the doctors incarnate in the text. So it is a refusal of a global character, of an absolute character in relation to a configuration that presents itself as self-totalizing, that claims to master the totality of what is, and he says no. And no to the demand that is given to him. I mentioned that I was talking about refusal last night, and I mentioned that this is a theme that runs throughout his text. It's quite extraordinary, the extent to which he continues to appeal to it, even in the 30s and then in the 40s and 50s. And in the 50s, I had copied for you a text called Refusal, which I thought we might look at very briefly. It was published in a publication edited by Dionys Muscolo, who was someone who's not well studied, I think, someone whose work deserves more attention. Anyway, Blanchot joined with him in this project, which was this journal with a political intent called Le 14 Juillet. So, refusal. He says, at a certain moment, when faced with public events, we know that we must refuse. Refusal is absolute, categorical. It does not discuss or voice its reasons. This is how it remains silent and solitary, even when it affirms itself as it should in broad daylight. Those who refuse, and who are bound by the force of refusal, know that they are not yet together. The time of common affirmation is precisely what has been taken away from them. What they are left with is the irreducible refusal, the friendship of this sure, unshakable, rigorous no that unites them and determines their solidarity. It's a very interesting passage where he says that this cannot be understood in terms of a commonality, at least in the first moment, but at another level entails a kind of friendship and solidarity. Friendship as a term, as I mentioned, is also very important to him in this period, which he drew from his relation with Bataille. The movement of refusal is rare and difficult, though equal and the same in each one of us as soon as we have taken it up. But why difficult? Because we must refuse not only the worst, and I think this is interesting, not only the worst, but also a reasonable semblance, a solution that will be deemed happy and even unhoped for. So there's no compromise here, and no negotiation, no compromise. In 1940, refusal had to be asserted not against the invading force, not accepting it was self-evident, but against the chance that Marshal Pétain claimed, no doubt in good faith, to represent, and against all the justifications he was able to invoke. Today, the exigency of refusal has not arisen in relation to the events of May 13th, which are refused by themselves, but in the face of this power that claimed to reconcile us with them honorably by the mere authority of a name. He was attacking de Gaulle there. What we refuse is not without value or importance. This is precisely why refusal is necessary. Again, it is uncompromising, unconditional, and in some respects it's refusing even what might be acceptable in this situation. It's not a reformist position in any sense at all. It is a refusal of the order within which both the bad and the not so bad are involved. There is a kind of, what we refuse is not without value or importance. This is precisely why refusal is necessary. There is a kind of reason that we will no longer accept. There is an appearance of wisdom that horrifies us. There is an offer of agreement and compromise that we will not hear. A rupture has occurred. We have been brought back to this frankness that does not tolerate complicity any longer. The temporality of this is always interesting. When he talks about refusal, he says, we proceed from something that has already come about. In other words, we might say we find our subjectivity in this event that has already preceded us. And this refusal doesn't derive simply from a subjective decision. This refusal, he says, comes from more anonymous sources, and we'll come to that. When we refuse with a movement freed from contempt and exaltation, one that is as far as possible anonymous. For the power of refusal is accomplished neither by us nor in our name, but from a very poor beginning that belongs first of all to those who cannot speak. I cited these lines last night, and this is what I was referring to just now. I didn't realize this is the next sentence. The power of refusal does not issue from a subject's capacity to say no. It comes from something more primordial. It says, from a very poor beginning that belongs first of all to those who cannot speak. So it's in a certain sense the last position. And he uses this term refusal. I mentioned this in his article on Robert Anton and his meditation on the camps. He says that those who suffer the oppression of the death camps come to a point of he says a silent refusal, which is he calls it a true speech. This silent refusal, but it is a true speech which is not articulated in any speaking that could lend itself to a dialectical struggle. This has to be brought in. Another instance is required to bring this into some form of struggle or some form of opposition. It's not an oppositional relation, this originating of refusal. It's a withholding that doesn't oppose the withholding instance over against. There's a kind of opposing of silence, but that's not an opposing that posits self and other, enemy and so. Today one might say that it is easy to refuse, that the exercise of this power carries little risk. This is no doubt true for most of us. I think, however, that refusal is never easy, that we must learn how to refuse and how to maintain intact this power of refusal by the rigor of thinking and modesty of expression that each one of our affirmations must evidence from now on. And that's the end of the statement. Now, what is this motif of refusal comes up, as I said, a lot, and it is it's a term that runs through a great deal of his writing from the time of 68. So I asked that this page 80 be photocopied for us. The first one, page refusal, is page 7. This is from the book called Political Writings, published by Fordham University Press. And then there's this sequence of writings that that are attributed to Blanchot, because he was writing some of these anonymously, and for this so-called Student Writer Action Committee during the events of 68. There are a lot of really beautiful, powerful statements, and one of these, I'm not sure where it is, we might actually come across it as I read a little bit of this to you, but he suggests that what was happening in 68 was, he says, an affirmation of a rupture that had already occurred, just like he says refusal has already occurred, so that when the streets were occupied, when the revolution took place, in a sense, it was affirming something that had already occurred, or a revolution that had already occurred. And so he says our task is to affirm the rupture, to carry out, to write out, in a sense, to bring forth this rupture. If you look at then page 80, by the power of refusal that it possesses, and through an incessant movement of struggle in close relation of solidarity with all workers, the student uprising has decisively struck the system of exploitation and oppression that rules this country. Through this very movement, it has decisively contributed to our withdrawal from political death, going so far as to overturn the apparatuses of traditional parties and groups. I'm reading this to you because you're hearing him now in the mode of the extreme gauche. Right? This is a political language. Right? It's the language of 68 on the extreme gauche, the extreme left, and he is joining that movement, but at the same time trying to give it over to its most radical meaning. and that's, all his statements are incessantly radical in the effort to try to get to that event, and to find ways to affirm the event that do not fall back into a traditional political position taking. Thus, everything must be done to preserve the meaning of this upheaval, the originality of the action that it denotes, the new liberty that it has already won for all. No organization today could claim to represent the revolutionary demand on its own. This is why, at a moment when government power, through measures that are, moreover, without any legal justification, and are based on defamatory arguments that could also ban every opposition group, seeks to impede the student struggle alongside the workers, the signatories of this text declare that any case against the members of the organizations targeted by the statute of dissolution must also be made against those who hold themselves responsible for the actions incriminated. They will support the accused with all the means at their disposal. I just read that again because I don't want to go into the meaning of it in terms of the circumstances, which I have a loose hold of anyway. But the way in which he starts, he will speak sometimes in very legalistic terms. I mean, he's claiming a right to refusal and invoking a sense of the law that goes all the way back to the 18th century. Let me jump over. I don't want to. If you would like to look at this from the perspective of political thinking, and I urge you to do so. There's an essay by Etienne Balibar called Blanchot l'insoumis. Blanchot, insoumis means unsubmitting, or you could even say refusing. Blanchot l'insoumis, and it is about the form of dissidence that Blanchot was pointing to with his notion of refusal. And Balibar is, he claims, he's suggesting that Blanchot was one of the leading thinkers for our contemporary thought of dissidence. But he's also trying to suggest that this notion of dissidence has a kind of quasi-legal basis in that he's trying to call upon a notion of a relation to the law that is at the grounds of any legality, that a law requires a kind of assent, and this refusal is speaking to that assent. For a law to hold as a law, there must be some form of assent, and this refusal withholds that assent. I wanted to look at one other passage for you, with you, which is at page 94. I should give you a bibliography, a note for that Balibar text, and I don't have it on. I'll have to look that up for you. I'll give that to you. This on the next page: tracts, posters, bulletins. There's a sentence here, I believe. I'll just read this, and let's read this together. This is a sentence I want you to hear. This is a text in which he affirms that there can be no writing about the revolution, or that any effort to describe the meaning of it, any effort to give its history, any effort to define the event, will in effect turn from the event, and the real task is to write the event, to affirm the rupture, as opposed to writing about it. Writing on, he says, is in any case inappropriate. But writing on the event, this is about representation. This is last week we were talking about political representation and the necessity of turning from representation, and I was in part inspired by Blanchot. So this is about representation. Writing on the event that is precisely destined, among others, no longer to allow us ever to write on epitaph, commentary, analysis, panegyric, condemnation, is to falsify it in advance and to have already missed it. We will never write on what took place or didn't take place in man, not out of respect, not out of concern not to restrain the event by circumscribing it. We admit that this refusal is one of the points where writing and the decision of rupture coincide. Both are always imminent and unpredictable. It's a very abrupt, almost elliptical statement, but we're not simply being modestly respectful of events and fear that we might not be adequate in our representation. No, representation itself is radically inappropriate for this event, which entails acting in that space opened in the revolution, or what he calls the rupture. Writing from this break in the legal and social order, which is precisely what he described when he says we are faced with a change of epoch. Something is happened. The extant legal order is dead, in effect, and we have to turn aside from it, and that means writing in a new way. He goes on, dozens of books have already been published dealing with what happened or didn't happen in May. They are generally intelligent, partially right, and maybe useful. Written by sociologists, professors, journalists, and even activists. Naturally, no one expected that the force of the movement, which in a way blocks it, would make the reality and the possibility of the book disappear. That is, its end and completion, its fulfillment. Again, these words should be resonating with what we read this morning. He's attacking the idea that May 68 could be contained in the book, be that the book of a history which gives the meaning of these events, or the book of a philosophy which gives its meaning in the sense of its essence. Any effort to capture the meaning of this in a way that would offer a totalizing account or any kind of account in terms of a historical progression would be a violation of what actually happened here, which is a breach in that order, that teleological order or that order of meaning. The book has not disappeared, this must be acknowledged. Nonetheless, we can say that everything in the history of our culture and in history, tout court, incessantly destines writing, not for the book, but for the absence of the book. What's happening here? Nonetheless, we can say that everything that in the history of our culture and in history tout court incessantly destines writing, not for the book, but for the absence of the book, has continued to announce the upheaval by preparing for it. There will still be books, and what's worse, beautiful books. But mural writing, this mode that is neither inscription nor enunciation, the tracts that are hastily distributed in the streets and are the manifestations of the haste of the streets, the posters that do not need to be read but are like a challenge to every law, words of disorder, the speech outside of discourse that marks our steps, political cries, and bulletins by the dozen like this one, everything that disturbs, calls, threatens, and finally questions without expecting an answer, without resting in certainty. Never will we enclose it in a book which, even when open, tends toward closure, a refined form of oppression. Again, this is all writing in a mode of refusal. Right? This is where refusal, as he said above, refusal comes together with the act of writing. In May, there is no book on May, not due to a lack of time or due to the necessity to act, but because of a more decisive obstacle. It is written elsewhere, in a world devoid of publication. It is distributed with the police and in a certain way with their help, violence against violence. The arrest of the book is also an arrest of history that, far from leading us back before culture, designates a point well beyond culture, and this is what most provokes authority, power, and the law. May this bulletin prolong this arrest while preventing it from being arrested, suspended, ended. No more books. Never again a book, so long as we maintain our relation with the upheaval of the rupture. And no more books. A story? No, no story. Never again. And it's the exact same language that we heard in Madness of the Day. Tracts, posters, bulletins, words of the streets, infinite words. It is not through a concern of effectiveness that they become imperative. Effective or not, they belong to the decision of the instant. They appear and they disappear. They do not say everything. On the contrary, they ruin everything. They are outside of everything. They act and reflect fragmentarily. There's one instance of the word fragment. They do not leave a trace without trace. Like words on the wall, they are written in insecurity, received under threat. They carry the danger themselves and then pass with the passerby who transmits, loses, or forgets it. And then there's this affirmation of effacement, a level of accepting passing, time, disappearance. And the core thing is affirming that fragmentation, affirming that effacement, and living in this moment of radical change of the cultural order, radical interruption of the cultural order. And so what I've wanted to do with looking at these few little texts from 68 is to show you how when 68 came, it was almost as though Blanchot had anticipated it in some sense. That this was what he was waiting for as a writer and as a political activist. And so there's a certain exaltation in his writing, a certain radicalism which just takes over because, in a certain sense, this is answering his sense of the nature of the break that he called, that was implicit in what he called the change of epoch. I'll go to An essay published in 1975 also in the Nouveau Commerce. In fact, that may be the discourse on patience that I've referred to. So, and it was subsequently collected in the Writing of the Disaster. And if you want to go look at that, that would be on page 17 in the English translation. He writes the following. He says, he's talking about refusal. There. It says, refusal is said to be the first degree of passivity. He's talking here, he seems to be picking up the idea that to the extent that refusal communicates with writing, there is in it a dimension of passivity. So we say no, but we don't do something instead, right? Although to affirm this refusal, or to write this refusal with those bulletin tracts and so forth, that's obviously a kind of acting. But he continues, he's meditating on the idea of the passive versus the active. And he says, refusal is said to be the first degree of passivity. But if refusal is deliberate and voluntary, if it expresses a decision, though this be a negative one, it does not yet allow us to separate it from the power of consciousness, remaining at best of a self that refuses. It is true that refusal tends toward the absolute, toward a sort of unconditional. This is the core of refusal, which Bartleby the Scrivener's inexorable "I would prefer not to do it" brings to it. An abstention which has never had to be decided upon, which precedes every decision, and which is more than a denial, something more like an abdication. The renunciation, never pronounced, never clarified, of ever saying anything, of the authority of speaking, or else an abnegation understood as the abandonment of the self, a relinquishment of identity, a refusal of self that does not cleave to refusal, but opens to failure, to the loss of being, to thought. I will not do it would still have signified an energetic determination, calling forth an equally energetic contradiction. I would prefer not to belongs to the infinite of patience, offering no hold to dialectical intervention. We have fallen out of being, he continues in an extraordinary sentence. We have fallen out of being in the field of the outside, where, immobile, walking with a slow and even step, the destroyed men come and go. Again, I'm curious. Suddenly he speaks in the first person and describes this infinite of patience or passivity, which he describes as an immobility, walking with a slow and even step, where the destroyed men come and go. So this is, he's taken, I've made a very sudden jump, and excuse me, this is a little bit abrupt. I've gone from refusal in the way in which it seems, it's actively announced in the moment of 68 and guides his thinking about a kind of dissidence, a refusal of the power that was first instantiated by de Gaulle and which is still alive, very much alive in 68. So it is a refusal of an entire order, and he is eager to understand that there is an exigency here, which means we must, as he says, affirm the break, affirm the rupture, carry this refusal out across the order of culture. But then, as he comes to think about a passive dimension of refusal, he writes these words, which I have been quoting, and starts down a kind of other slope of refusal. There's the active side of it, and then there is this passive side that he starts to draw out. And we have another phrase about this. It comes up again in the Writing of the Disaster, and it's page 145, another phrasing of this passivity. He writes the following. He says, again, returning to Bartleby, the Scrivener. In Bartleby, the enigma comes from pure writing, which can only be that of a copying, a rewriting, from the passivity into which this activity disappears, in which passes imperceptibly and suddenly from ordinary passivity, reproduction, to the beyond of everything passive, to a life so passive, for it has the hidden decency of dying, that it does not issue in death, never makes death an escape. Bartleby copies. He writes incessantly and cannot stop long enough to submit to anything resembling control. I would prefer not to do it. This sentence, Blanchot continues, speaks in the intimacy of our nuts. Negative preference. The negation that effaces preference and is effaced therein. The neuter of that which is not among the things there are to do. The restraint, the gentleness that cannot be called obstinate and that frustrates obstinacy with those few words. Language goes silent and perpetuating itself. It's an extraordinary phrase. Again, it's like following in refusal a kind of underside or an abyssal dimension, which is this passivity, which leads into, he says, a negative preference, but he says a negation that effaces preference. Any willing, any subject position, any inclination is undone in this expression, I would prefer not to. So a negation that effaces preference and is effaced therein. So this negation is negating itself, but without giving an Aufhebung, in the Hegelian sense. It doesn't turn into an affirmation. It is a kind of neutral suspension, heading into that space, as he says, where the destroyed men come and go. Now, the reason for my reading that here is that I asked about the relation between the no and the yes in the madness of the day. And in that no, we seem to have something, I said it's almost as though the narrator's incapacity and strange patience or passivity suddenly comes into focus, and he says no in relation to the technical order which is demanding an account from him. But the question is, what is the relation between that no and the yes? If we press this notion of passivity in the no, perhaps we are rejoining that transgression that was described in the narrator's experience of exposure to something like seeing God. And perhaps there we have passage into this space that he describes as a negation that effaces preference and is effaced therein. So that a kind of suspension of negation. Or a negation that can no longer negate itself in the sense of turning into an affirmation. Of course, a negation that would negate itself, again, is the Hegelian term, dialectical move. And what he's describing here would be a suspension which, again, a suspension of negation which in its passive presence, strange kind of presence, but in its passivity, in its transgressive patience, would turn into a kind of affirmation. It's a negation that can't negate itself, and thereby is, in some sense, there as not as an affirmation of something, but a kind of presence of this passivity or patience. Now, that doesn't help, you might say. It doesn't help this trying to think this relation between the no and the yes, except that he seems to be touching upon what he calls, in this phrase that I just read, something like a neutral site, right? Or what he calls the neuter. And I cite again from the passage I just read, it's the writing of the disaster, page 145. This sentence speaks in the intimacy of our nights. I would prefer not to. Negative preference, the negation that effaces preference and is effaced therein. And then he continues, the neuter of that which is not among things there are to do. The restraint, the gentleness that cannot be called obstinate and that frustrates obstinacy with those few words. Gentleness, restraint, again, passivity which is no longer suggesting some preference or inclination, but a relation to the neutral. Now, the reason I mention this is I will come back to this probably the day after tomorrow, and as I try to approach this question of the neutral. But I alluded to this last night. I said that in the relation to the neutral, Blanchot seems to find some kind of deliverance, or some deliverance is too strong a word, but in the suspensive movement that we see described here, to which he's alluding, there is the emergence of, again, a kind of affirmation, a kind of yes. I'm going to give you a couple passages from Lacou-Labarthe, The Step Not Beyond, where he says this fairly explicitly. So, the neuter, what he's trying to do is, in a certain sense, move back beyond negativity, before negativity, into this space which is neither passive nor active, ni l'un ni l'autre, he says, which is what neuter means in Latin. Neither the one nor the other, ne uter. And to the point where negation itself, the ni, neither this nor that, negation itself starts to be suspended, and there is this suspension, that suspended relation, and it's in that opening or that suspension that this other affirmation comes. That's about all I can say at this point, in relation to this text, and it's certainly, in the madness of the day, it's not there. I mean, the move between the no and the yes is not given to us. We know that somehow the relation to this transgressive dying is transmuted into an affirmation. And it becomes, I think it remains mysterious. We do know that the yes comes from the space of a transcendence. That the yes is from beyond the order of the day in some way, and that this passivity that this subject experiences when he is I'm going to cite again that sentence which I used earlier. Remember, I alluded to this. He said, this is whoever sees God dies. This is because dying is a manner of seeing the invisible, a manner of saying the unsayable. The indiscretion in which God, become in some sense necessarily a God without truth, would be given over to passivity. Well, that passivity which we see in the subject after the event of the blinding, near blinding, seems to be communicating in some sense, or seems to be at the place where this affirmation comes forth. And so this relation between the yes and the no I'm describing seems to be coming from that limit, or that very poor beginning that he described in talking about the passivity in refusal, or that obscure origin of refusal. So, following this meditation on refusal, we seem to be carried back to a site of what he calls here neutral suspension. And that same site seems to be where the yes comes from. But the relation between the yes and the no seems to be a neutral one. It's not, we can't say that he transmutes the no into a yes. But in this passivity, there is this turning somehow. There is this passing by which becomes a transgressive deliverance. Yeah.
It does seem like in getting to the blinding, it seems like, so he has this vision, and it's this vision of this sort of past, present, and future, really all in one vision. It almost feels like the blinding is the system trying to tell him that he's blind, trying to affirm that he's not seeing, because he says, no one scratched me, or he says, I had no enemies, no one bothered me, and yet the law and the eye doctor and the psychiatrist want to tell him that there's been a trauma, and they're trying to explain to him why he can't see, maybe.
Or why he's so disturbed by this, because he's acting in very strange ways after.
Right.
He says his sight is nearly restored. Remember, apparently he's doing pretty well, but he's walking through the streets at the same time. He says like a crowd.
Right, trying to cling to something.
So something has gone, profoundly wrong in relation to his sight.
Yeah, and in the way that the law is trying to sort of flirt with him, they're trying to kind of make this okay, again, like with themselves. But the whole thing of the blindness feels like they're they're both trying to affirm that he's been blinded and that he has a trauma that's affecting him in some way. Like, those are the only terms that anyone has to define this epiphany that he's had. It's like, well, it must be either you're crazy or you're blind.
And his way of playing it down almost suggests, this blinding thing is beside the point.
Right.
The fact that somebody crushed glass in my eyes is not really what's pertinent here.
Yeah.
So
And even with the, they're like, you can't talk because the bandages that's what's going to be healing with you,
yes.
for you.
Yeah.
So there's this whole thing about, like, we're all okay, right? Like, don't talk, it'll be, appeasing him, and he's just kind of sitting with it, because I think it is this moment of knowledge and revelation for him that allows him, maybe, that to be calm in the midst of it. It's like, sure, you can say that.
And it is an opening of desire at the same time. It's a desire they can't account for, because he says, I want the light, and if this means I go insane, I want insanity. And so there's an excessive kind of desire still, or is manifesting itself here, that cannot be quite accommodated in that technical account of his suffering.
Right, and the fact is, it's not that he's been blinded, he's seeing in a different way. And so that's why he's kind of stumbling around, because he's seeing something completely new, and the only way that anybody can explain it is that he's blind.
Yeah, or completely crazy.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Other thoughts? This is very strange teaching this text this way, so intensely, and I'm not sure. I hope that what I've been trying to suggest is somewhat intelligible. I'm not claiming that it is intelligible, but I'm just trying to follow this. I'm trying to follow him back, in a certain sense, to this site of passivity, and then try to meditate on this turning that occurs, this enigmatic turn which allows an affirmation that is impossible in a certain sense, or it's an affirmation of the impossible, if we speak in a time sense. Yeah, Mark.
Just a very basic, simple question. Who exactly constitutes the we that Blanchot refers to?
Which we are you referring to?
In Refusal, we, at a certain moment, when faced with public events, we know that we must refuse.
It's that solidarity, that friendship that he describes. It's the we of that friendship of the first paragraph, I think. So it's not a constituted identity by any means.
But it implies another who's not we, which would be dialectical in the traditional sense.
Yes.
So he hasn't quite gone beyond it.
It's not a self over against another.
Yes.
It's nothing but the friendship of the refusal.
It sort of reminds me of what Rancière talks about in his talk, his discussion about politics, mainly just because of the part at the end of the first page, from a very poor beginning, that he belongs, first of all, to those who cannot speak. And with Rancière, the political really starts from that space in society where those who cannot speak, those who are invisible, inaudible, exist. So it sort of, I think, relates to Rancière, but there's perhaps a difference, I think, in this refusal here and the one in the madness of the day, because here there's a beginning for those people who cannot speak, that nature where they are in a place where they have that inability, but in here he sort of refuses to speak, even though he has that ability to go beyond silence.
Mm-hmm.
So to me, it's maybe perhaps somewhat different in its functioning.
Well, you mean the madness of the day is different because he could speak.
And it was going to, the refusal here then sort of works against those who cannot speak in that situation. In that regard, I guess.
Well, I wonder to what degree he can speak. He remains. He says, "Look, I'm telling you everything." And then my silence, which is what can't, the unsayable, is hidden. In a certain sense, that is also the silence of one who can't speak, because it can't be brought to any saying. I mean, you almost get the sense as when he's first telling the story, well, I'm telling you all I can. And then we learn, in fact, there has been a hiding. But what is hidden? It's the saying of the unsayable. And so that we are close to that, what I recall of that true speech that Blanchot attributes to those suffering in the death camps. Though it's not the speech of a subject that has come into formation. It's rather a speech of those who are losing subjectivity, or and on their way toward a really radical silence. So it's yeah. I mean he can speak, but when he does speak, he speaks in in this strange kind of affirmation, which is almost incomprehensible. It's another kind of saying, and then he joins it, as I said, to this beautiful affirmation, or a yes to life and yes to death, that he attributes to mostly to women, and so there is an allusion to a different kind of speaking or writing, one that would entail this yes saying. But it is still, in relation to the order, the given order, it's a kind of silence, or it's unintelligible. It escapes, what is expected of a cultural authority, in the sense of the writer. It escapes cultural power, as he suggests in that text on writing and bulletins and tracts. And in that, this kind of saying is unacceptable, or this is transgressive in relation to what we would expect of culture. And that, we certainly saw that when a certain kind of women's writing was affirmed in the 60s and 70s. This provoked some pretty extraordinary reactions, even among feminists in that time. The writing of people like Sixou or Heidegger was pretty transgressive, and it provoked some pretty irate reactions, even in the movement, because it was not conforming to what was expected of a meaningful, full speech. Yeah, that's why I suggest the law is fooling with literature here, and this is a saying that's proper to literature, not to a political stance. And the issue would be, how do we take that kind of yes to life into a political context? But this text, I don't think, gives us that, at least in any way that I can see very immediately. It just, to me, it introduces an enigma and a challenge to try to grasp how such an affirmation might take form, and how it might speak in our words or speak in our actions, and a constant invitation to think about a non-resentful politics, saying yes to life, yes to death, yes to the noise of life, yes to the fact of dying and effacement and the passing of time. So not a negation of temporality in this sense. Or maybe this is what someone was trying to talk about, temporality again. Not a negation of the passing of time, but an acceptance of that passing. So a politics without resentment, in the sense of assaulting.
Would you call that a different kind of dialectic, or something other than any kind of dialectic?
Well, it would...
Something altogether new, coming out of the neutral, that is...
Yes. I mean, it would be something other than a dialectical... It wouldn't be a dialectical position, because it's not about opposition and positing in the way that the dialectical would require in a political context.
Mm-hmm. But is the neutral is in a sense between the two sides, or around, or concerning both in some sense?
Yeah. I mean, the neutral is an especially dangerous term in some respects when we start talking about politics, and an especially problematic term. But if we bring it into this context in a way I've tried to do here, in saying that the movement of refusal, in refusal there is a passivity that goes toward the neutral, and it's from a neutral relation that there can be something like this affirmation. I think we need to hold on to that. But in thinking about politics, this is very problematic, and I think it's especially interesting here that when he gives us the yes, it is to some extent gendered. the yes is something between that ecstatic yes of this man and the yes which is normally that of beautiful creatures. So the relation between the yes and the no has to be thought really in relation to the double yes and that no.
Why would the neutral be considered problematic for politics?
Well, in politics,
Because
usually
it's
we speak of
irrelevant.
neutrality. It's
People
not,
think it's irrelevant because it's not taking up a position,
yes,
or people think it's threatening
yes,
because it's not clear where it stands.
yes. And it's certainly not the Swiss form. It's not the Swiss form. In this case. I'm sorry, I couldn't resist that. Yeah.
So in what way is this idea related to Bataille's idea of sovereignty and transgression? Because I remember that Foucault referred to this concept of sovereignty of Bataille as a non-affirmative affirmation.
Yes.
Is it like...
Yes, there I think he's rendering that in somewhat of a Blanchotian form. And Blanchot is a little bit uneasy about that transgression because in Acéphale sometimes there are these ecstatic declarations of Bataille, and one senses that in this kind of sacrifice of the self there's still a kind of power being affirmed, still a kind of almost a latent self and its own sacrifice being affirmed. And Blanchot is trying to push a little bit farther toward the precisely that impersonality, that loss of self, and the as you said, how did you phrase it? A powerless affirmation. What did
non-affirmative
non-affirmative affirmation. Yeah. Without a willing, without a power, but nevertheless a yes. Yeah. It's I as I say, I think it's as though he's trying to say something about Bataille when he gives us that figure of the law and the one that the law is engaged in these erotic relations with, and that somehow he seems to be suggesting this is not quite enough yet for the yes he's trying to think.
Did he explicitly see himself as a theoretician of a new form of politics, or is that?
No, I think he Well, I think he said to when '68 happened, this is it. This is what politics has to be. This is where we have to proceed from. And
yet the refusal there was more active than the more passive refusal you spoke of after.
I'm sorry.
Well, I think when you were talking about the refusal, you were talking about an active refusal.
Yes,
So
affirming the rupture.
And then you were talking about more passive refusal.
Yes.
So it's more generalised.
Yeah.
About 68.
And I think in a certain sense, as he starts to meditate on that refusal, he sees in it this other dimension, this almost abyssal dimension of a passivity. Yes, Jim.
I wanted to ask you just to, I suppose, repeat or expand upon the problematic nature of neutrality in this dialectic that's not a dialectic, and this constant invocation of the political, because I suppose, forgive me for sort of ventriloquizing Lenin at this point, but this invocation as well of Gauche just brings to mind for me as a mostly well-known ultra-leftism and infantile disorder, which, by the way, I think does a massive disservice to infants, which I think are fantastic little creatures, and ultra-leftists not so much. But what I'm kind of wondering about with this dialectic in which the kind of opposition doesn't negate itself. Of course, the sort of classical point that Marx takes up on this is the idea that the proletariat doesn't just negate the bourgeoisie, but negates itself, in order that then we have simply an opening into a new society. That's very, very important that the proletariat negates itself and the bourgeoisie, because this is a negation of the entire social order itself. So, having a negation of the bourgeoisie without the negation of the proletariat itself, I mean, there is a good name for this of workerism, which is not particularly revolutionary at all. It's very questionable. And it's this kind of radical non-radicalism. And I'm wondering, is this a moment of the problem you see with neutrality, or is there some other stuff going on in this community?
Afraid I can't be as eloquent as you on that. But I'm a little bit puzzled about the way you phrase this movement of negation, because it would seem to me that what Blanchot is trying to think is precisely something that comes with the negation of the proletariat. So it would be the negation of the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. It would be, in that sense, an opening onto this new society. But for Blanchot, I think part of the difficulty is how we think negation itself, how we think the power of negation. And so he often says, in order to begin to think fragmentation, in order to begin to think this change of epoch, to begin to think what opens here, this other kind of affirmation, this other kind of presence and so forth, we must complete history. So in a sense, it's that movement that you're describing. So he says, we must go with Marx and Lenin in this sense, all the way. And there see in some sense, what negation cannot quite capture, or what is, that infantile dimension that you're talking about in the affirmative sense. That's where another power starts to manifest itself. And so, in a way, I suppose, because he does believe in something like justice, it's for that reason he does affirm communism. But he sees that communism has to be thought as a threshold, and we have to rethink this. How could I say what's the word I'm looking for? This way of using the negative, and so it's he's really saying it's not until we actually complete the project, or the project has been announced, has been fulfilled in the sense that it's been fully announced. In other words, that the end has been conceived, as the advent of communism. And he says at that point, when the end has occurred, then the question begins of how we say this ending. What comes after the end in that respect, as the limits of negation begin to show themselves. And there, I'm not enough of a political theorist to talk about that in terms, I think, that are consonant with your own, which are very precise.